Good morning. My name's Katelynn Carter-Rogers, and we decided today that it's really important to kind of discuss our positionality before we get into the topic. So I started at St. Mary's in 2007, and I walked into this institution as a first-generation Indigenous student, and I kind of came with baggage, a lot of baggage. My mom's a 60 scoop survivor. Hold on one sec. This is really deep for me because I grew up here. Okay. So my mom's a 60 scoop survivor and was greatly impacted by the residential schools. And when I came in here, I had baggage and I had barriers. I had a lot of housing insecurity while I was in this institution. And I had used the psychology department as kind of like home for me in the social attitudes lab. And so those walls were very protective for me. But there were times where I had so many barriers that it wasn't just the institution, it was people, it was other students. I didn't really feel like I could relate to anybody. And I've given this presentation before, but just not in front of you guys. And I held myself together, but I think because you guys have watched me since I was 17 and now being 33, I've come a long way. And I think that that's important. And I think that I can now tell you guys that I'm an assistant professor at St. FX in Indigenous business. And I can and as Steve could say, I think I was held to a higher standard at some points working at the time he was the Dean of Science. And so I feel like I was held to a standard, not because he held me to it, but because I held it to myself to that standard, to have to work with really, really great people. And so that being said, today we want to kind of talk about how we developed a program around first year experience for individuals who have barriers as they come in. Okay? Your turn, Vurain.
I'd like to begin by saying it's been an absolute honor to work with Katelynn on this work we've been doing for the last 4.5 years. And it's also been an honor to work with Steve, who's been guiding us and making sure we're getting this very, very important work done. Yeah, and Katelynn, thank you so much for all you do. Look, Katelynn really runs the show. We kind of get a little bit of the glory, but she's the one who's driving the ship. She's the one who's making sure that everything's happening and everything. So we should acknowledge that, because she's really, most of this has come out of work that she's been very passionate in pursuing. My name is Vurain Tabvuma. You can probably tell that it's a African name. I'm originally from Zimbabwe, and that should immediately, for people who know, should give you some sort of insight into why inclusivity is an important topic for me. Zimbabwe is a country that is born out of the desire to make an inclusive country for everyone. If you know the history with apartheid and all that. So I've also lived in many different places. So within Zimbabwe, I moved around a lot. But from the time I was a young adult, I spent a significant amount of time in South Africa. Lived in England for 12 years. Also lived a lot of time. I've also spent the last 8 years of my life living in Canada. So from, having moved around a lot, one of the things you get to experience when you move around a lot is to, one of the most important things is trying to fit in all the different places you move to, right? The first thing that happens when you go somewhere new is to try and understand how do I get a sense of belonging, right? Which is where all this work started off from, that word belonging that Katelynn mentioned so many years ago, right? So that's central to me. So that's important to me. So that's why we are pursuing this work. So yeah, I'll pass it on to Steve. Yeah.
Thank you. So I come at this from a very different perspective. I come from great privilege. I had privilege all my life. My family always had money. It was expected I would get through university, and graduate school was also kind of expected. My brother and I both got PhDs. My parents both had master's degrees. And so my arrival at inclusion and issues around belonging and diversity came later. And as Katelynn was saying, it's about positioning ourselves. And I came to it in the context of when I started working at administrative roles. So in 2003, I got here in 2003, I was already on the union executive. And that's when I started getting introduced to EDIA issues. And I became president of the union by accident. That's a completely other story, which I won't get into here. But then I became an associate dean, and part of my role was around recruitment. And then I became dean of science. And one of the big issues, those of you in science will know, is that there are not nearly as many women in science as there should be. And so that became a big focus of what I worked on as dean. And then I was eventually asked to take on a number of different roles around student success. And fundamentally, student success is around belonging, about sense of belonging, about feeling you belong at the institution. And that involves making sure that everyone feels included. And we have a very diverse campus. But that diversity is largely driven by international students. We don't have a very large African Nova Scotian population. We do not have a very large Indigenous population. So that became a big focus of how we could change that and how we can start looking at things. And so I'm going to talk a bit about what we are as an institution and how we got to this particular point, and then I'll turn it back over to Vurain and Katelynn to talk about the research. First, I'd like to acknowledge a number of the collaborators that we've had on this work. Tom Brophy, who's the AVP Student Affairs and Services, has been a very close collaborator of ours, is currently the chair of the SEM plan. Adam Daniels, who's the manager of the SEM implementation plan, has been involved. Tracy McDonald in institutional analysis. Katelynn worked for her for a long time and has been very interested in these kinds of issues. Daryl Rooney in financial services. He gave us the money to do most of the work that we're talking about here until we got SSHRC funding. Megan, who will be speaking later today, has been involved from the very beginning. Will Kay, who's the manager of program development and review. Debbie Brother Scott, who is a collaborator on our SSHRC grant. Johnny White, we won't really talk about the work we're doing with him, but he's a postdoc of mine now, was my master's student in IO almost 20 years ago, and is running a company that's developing a student success app. And of course, Nicole Conrad, who actually did one of the early projects on the FYE program with one of her psych classes. What I'm going to do very quickly is give a brief overview of the SMU and the SEM plan. I'm going to talk about some of our initiatives, how we will talk about how to implement and how we implemented a co-curricular FYE program, also often called first-year seminar programs. We call it the first-year experience program. Often first-year experience programs are much broader. The university has a first-year, oh, I realize I'm just missing one person here. The first-year experience program is quite broad and covers a lot of different topics and transition in, through, and out of the university. We'll talk about our initial findings and then our future research and what we're doing with the funding that we've gotten. So I'm going to stand in front of the slides now because I know I'll be on this camera. And also I feel I'm crowding Katelynn and Vurain. The university, this is from a couple years ago. You'll notice, for example, we split by male and female and unspecified, which is, of course, not nearly appropriate terminology, but that terminology has changed. So as we get data in the future, it will use appropriate language. We're pretty much evenly split these days. There's been tremendous growth in science. Science used to be quite small. I won't take the credit, but it did happen when I was dean. So we're almost evenly split now. Most of our students come to us from high school, although we have a significant transfer students. 56% of our students come from Nova Scotia, about 60% of our undergraduates, and 32% of our graduate students. We've had a pretty big shift in our international student population. It used to be around 33%. It's now down to about 27, 28%. And most of our students are full-time. A couple other facts, most of our students are commuter students. More of our students work more hours than students typically do at university. As a university, not everyone knows this, we are the least publicly funded university in the country. Most universities in Canada are funded between 60 and 75% by the province. We get around 27%. This is our year 1 to year 2 retention rates over the last almost decade. Year 1 to year 2 retention rates are the primary way that we assess student retention. When does, and then because that's where we lose the vast majority of our students who leave university is between year 1 and year 2. You'll notice it's been fairly steady. It dipped down to around 75% before we very actively went into some of our inclusion, or I should say our student experience stuff, and has gone up to 83% in the middle of COVID. This is actually going to dip when we report this next year. There's a lot of reasons why it went up during COVID, and there's a lot of reasons why it's going down now. But the important thing to notice is there's been a slow trend upwards. Graduation rate is much harder to move, but it is gonna, hopefully will slowly go up. And this is our average entering grade. So you're seeing a very steady increase in our average entering grade as we go through the years. Happy to dive into any of this data at some point, probably not during this session because we're gonna run out of time. How does this look across faculties? This is actually the dip that we are going to see. Our total dip is going to, our total retention rate is going to go from 83 to 79. You'll see the Faculty of Arts has the largest drop. Couple reasons for that, which we can get into. Faculty of Science, Sobey School of Business have mitigated drops. Question? Oh, okay. I thought you put your hand up. Okay. Oh, by the way, that was asked with the last speakers. We're happy to take questions as it goes along. If there's questions in the chat that anyone wants to ask us. Again, happy to go into why it looks like this, but I won't right now. Strategic Enrollment Management Plan. Hopefully some of you have heard of this. This is something that Tom Brophy and I developed along with about 120 other people from across the university. And what we did here was really look at how do we improve student retention at the university. I won't go into the details there, but the point is that when we talk about student retention, we talk about inclusion, we talk about belonging. This is very much across the entire process of the student experience. From the very first time they get a sense of our university and they hear the name of the university, all the way until they're contributing graduates and alumni. All right. So it's a very broad perspective on how we look at things. What we're going to talk about today is primarily focused around the first year course in business, because that's where we've done most of our work. But we want to be clear that what we're talking about is actually a very broad range of information. We think of the student experience as a web. And there's all kinds of experiences students have at university. It is not just academics. It is their experience in residence. It's their experience with their friends. It's how they're managing those relationships with people that might be back home, how they're managing their finances, all kinds of things. It's a very, very broad range of things. And those go into co-curricular, academic experiences, issues around academic skills. And we now have a Student Success Center to help with all of those things. And importantly, in order for the student to be successful, these units need to work together. You can't have silos in a university. A student coming in has no concept of how you've defined your university and how you define your units. And frankly, they don't care. And also, frankly, they shouldn't have to care. All they know is they need the support. And we as an institution have a duty to provide that support. So why do we care about student success?
It's a very good question, Neil. Why do we care? Yeah, my hair is long. It's going to be difficult to take it off. Well, there we go. So we care about student success for the reasons that are up there. Right? It's obviously the right thing to do, right? It's something that is important, and students, we're a university, and it's the central purpose of our existence is to train students, to teach students, and that is what we do. Then it's definitely the right thing to do, to care about student success. It's good for the students because if we prepare our students properly, they become more effective learners. They're better able to navigate the university environment, and they're more likely to graduate. So it's a good thing for them. It's good for society because we're going to produce wonderful young people that are going to make very good contributions to society. It's good for our reputation, obviously, and it's also good for the university's bottom line. So this first year experience approach that we've taken here is good for everyone. It's one of those win-win-win type things. It's important to think about, how, like, it's important to realize that when we started doing this work, one of the key things we wanted to fully understand was, we're going to identify a bunch of potential interventions, but we really wanted to know how effective these interventions were, right? Because we knew that we were going to try out different things, but because the student body is diverse, because people coming from very different perspectives, it is important that we developed an assessment mechanism or two to be able to actually understand whether we're making a difference or not, right? So we've taken a very, we've been very rigorous in how we've assessed this this program that we've developed. But in addition to that, it's important. Assessment is important because it makes everyone accountable, right? If we're taking these interventions, then it's good for us to know how good our interventions have been, and it's good for the students to know how effective these interventions are. It allows us to be better focused, to better target the interventions that we're giving the students, and that area there on focus is something that we're working on with the app. We're not going to discuss it too much right now, but the central feature of the student app is trying to give students more targeted help and interventions that help their very unique and specific situation. And it also makes it very clear what is expected, right? So just to give you a general sense of what we've done and how we've done this. So we've developed this first year experience approach. As Steve mentioned, it's a co-curricular first year program. What that means is that we have embedded this first year experience course into an existing course. So this has been embedded in the Intro to Business Management course that every single first year student takes here at St. Mary's. It's also been adopted by chemistry. Most students of Faculty of Science are having the same intervention as well. So the key element with this is understanding whether or not it works, and in understanding, in trying to understand whether it's been effective, we've measured different things. We've looked at whether it's improved time management of the students who are taking the course. We've also looked at whether there's a difference in whether students are learning online and in person. This was something that was really important to understand during the worst part of COVID, right? Trying to understand whether this more inclusive working approach that we're trying to develop works in online and in in-person settings. And also a key thing we're measuring is the role of inclusion. And Katelynn would touch on that in a little bit more detail. There's other programs that we're not going to get into too much detail, but we're working with the Student Success app, and we've managed to get more support from the university. So just to be more specific as to what we're actually doing, we've identified several key areas that students need support with. So this is based on research and our own internal work we've done over the years. So we address the key areas we address is students' personal values, how effectively students work together. This is where these inclusive aspects start to become very important. How students manage stress, time management, career planning, how students take notes, read, remember, study, presentation skills, and effective writing. So all of these things are skills that have been shown to be important in helping students become more effective at university. Right? So we've been running this program since 2018. So this is the 5th year of us working, of us developing this program. In the original iteration, we used a quasi-experimental approach. We had all the first year students in business, in my case, being involved, but only about half of those received the first year experience intervention, and the other half had the traditional course. And that allowed us to essentially compare the differences between the two groups. In terms of what we found, initially it was quite stark, or at least when we started analyzing the data, the first tranche of data that came through, we thought that the interventions that we had would lead to an increase in all the different aspects we're measuring. But what we actually found was that there's actually a decrease, or at least from the student's perspective, there's a decrease across the board for all the students. There's a decrease in how students feel they're able to navigate academic advice, knowing campus activities, the knowledge of the library, the time management skills, and all these different skills, right? And you think this is quite concerning, right? We're like, oh, we've spent months and months and months developing this program to make students' lives better and to increase student success. And the data we got was there's this decline. It's like, well, obviously we're failing or something is wrong, But actually, when, thankfully, once, because of the experimental design, what we actually realized was that, yes, there's a decline, but the decline was much less for the students that had received the intervention, right? So in psychology, I think this is called the honeymoon hangover effect, right? There's another term for it, I'm forgetting, but as people, I think in psychology, the idea is that people overestimate how good they think they're going to be at something in the beginning, right? But once they're in the situation, it's like, this is more difficult than and it's more difficult or more challenging than I anticipated. Then suddenly, we are not as confident anymore, right? So that's the general effect, but we found that our intervention mitigates that significantly. And that's a paper that this result has been published, or it's been presented at conferences, and it's in a paper that's hopefully going to be published soon. And also we found that there's significant differences in academic performance. Students that have received the first year experience training have performed better in exams and by 10%, which is quite stark, because the students got the exact same lecture materials, exact same learnings, and exact same midterms, exact same exams, and the students that got the intervention were did 10% better than the students in the other in the control group.
We had one more thing.
Yes.
Forgot to put on there that it also, we now have data to show that it improved retention from year 1 to year 2 by 4%. So that's, and 6%. We don't,
6%, yeah.
And we don't get into it in this talk, but I literally have run the numbers on how much that's worth, dollar figure for the university. That's why we get funding.
Yes. Yeah, which is quite stark. Was we've been to different conferences, and many universities are happy just to get a 1% increase, right? And we've gotten a 6% increase in retention, which is quite amazing. Yeah. So in terms of the outcomes we found, I kind of talked to some of those already, but we've demonstrated that the FYE program definitely improves grades. We've found difference between in-person and online learning. When COVID struck, we found that the students that received the first experience training were much more effective in their time management, and that translated to grades as well. And yeah, I will pass it on to Katelynn now, who's going to give you. Thanks.
I think it's also important to mention that we did do a lot of student success stuff in the psychology department as well. Tanya's class had it, Nicole's class had it as well. And so I think that's also really important to discuss. So we ended up getting an Insights grant, and I'm going to focus specifically on phase 1 because that is where we start talking about student success and that are like the integration of inclusion within our program. But essentially the overall encompassing project looked at an onboarding process on how to implement inclusive procedures for students who are transitioning from academia into the workforce. So that's kind of what our goal is at the end, but let's talk about phase 1. So the research questions that I'm focusing on, this is actually around my PhD, is using an EDIA co-curriculum, can the FYE program help improve students' sense of belonging, their self-efficacy, and overall academic performance? And then we look at it from an intersectional perspective, and we want to know is how is the FYE program impacting marginalized populations on campus, and are there resources that are not present that will help specific populations better? And how can the FYE program help students overcome barriers and remain successful throughout their degree? So we measured their outcome expectations, so where they think their goals are going, what are their goals overall in goal development, general belonging and university belonging, self-efficacy, and time management. So time management is important because we actually have an entire embedded time management program inside the FYE program. And we've had a lot of success there in regards to having students being able to have increased sleep patterns, less time playing video games, which is really important. But we ended up controlling for gender, whether students were international or not, if they were in person or online, and their educational barriers. So we asked students to self-report any educational barriers that they had, whether it's generational trauma, substance abuse, if they were working, anything along those lines. They didn't have to report it, but if they did, it was something that we would have access to and be able to understand more fully. Vurain, same concept, except for this time we took the program that we knew worked, we knew it was effective, and we put it from the in and online perspective as well as in person. But this time around, I also talked about, I wanted to understand what inclusive practices existed within our program. And what we ended up doing is at the beginning, at the beginning of the classes, we asked students to self-report if they were first generation. We asked them to report whether or not they had accessibility concerns. We really felt it was important that the students knew who the faculty member was and how they were, what their position was, but also understanding who they were. And then we created groups for the students to work with from people who came from different backgrounds so that they could learn from each other. And we had them talk and tell each other, like they would basically talk to each other, and then the other person would present on this said person and say, this is really neat. This is what I've learned about so person. I think they're amazing, blah, 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 those type of things, right? To kind of get an idea of this relationship that the students were building. And we also wanted to let the other students know that if they were, let's say, a first generation student or an Indigenous student, that there were other first generation students or Indigenous students or Black students in the class, or if someone had accessibility concerns, that people didn't feel like they were alone. So we felt that that was also very important. So let's talk about the results. So again, same setup that we had done previously, just adding in this whole component around inclusion. And what we ended up finding is that students that were so I actually did a split between in person and online first to start before I kind of broke down the whole predictor aspect of it. But we ended up finding that the online class had significantly less feelings of belongingness, general belonging on as it related to the institution from being online in comparison to the ones that were in person, which I think generally makes sense because they're not physically here. And while self-efficacy was significantly lower as well. In regards to their marks, we saw that the online students had done significantly less. Their grades were significantly less in comparison to the students that were in person as well. So at first that was kind of concerning. But when we try to kind of consider like the individuals who were online versus individuals who were in person, what barriers existed for them, maybe they were working a lot more, maybe they had children at home with them. There was other different types of options. I just decided that I wanted to look at the predictors of the transition overall. And we found at the beginning that in-person was significantly better, but we also found that there was educational barriers that were influencing. So I controlled for them. In-person still was doing significantly better, but you can see that educational barriers was no longer a concern. And we see an increase of their sense of belongingness, their self-efficacy, their university belonging, and their time management abilities were predictive of their transition. I created a model of inclusion within the classroom and within higher education. And we learned that essentially what I'm saying is that academic self-efficacy leads to university affiliation, which then both lead to the outcome expectancy, so their goal development, which then leads to second order latent variable of perceived inclusion, which then in the end predicts sense of belonging and their overall academic performance. And I was able to replicate this across 3 different forms. So it's amazing. So it's really great to see that we are seeing inclusion within the FYE programs overall. Our overall success, like the overall success changes, kind of going through and as we built through, as we looked at all of our studies across all of our experiments, because we had done many, thank you. We noticed that we're seeing students that they're meeting academic demands, they're getting academic advice, they're understanding content and finding help when needed. There was also an impact on their living arrangements and like whether be able to like work and be able to live off campus and have an access that had a huge impact. And we've seen an increase there. Their time management and their ability to use online tools increased as well. Their connection with their instructor helped a lot. So that was Vurain. So they connected very well with Vurain as well as the TAs that were involved. We saw a decline in peer collaboration, especially in regards to the online component, because they just didn't really, I think COVID had a massive impact on people collaborating and using the online library as well. So we saw that there is a gap there that maybe we need to start kind of thinking about resources about students having access to the online library overall. And this essentially one of the big things that I think is important for all of our first year classes is that it's really important that we are collecting data to assess how our students are doing. And so if we just essentially if we use just their performance, like their academic grades to predict how well they're doing or how we think people are doing, we're missing a lot. And so essentially just kind of getting an idea whether it doesn't need to be for publication purposes, but just like program assessment, right? Of how well your classes are doing and asking students at the beginning, let's just kind of get an idea of where you are. And then by the end, being able to see, okay, this is what I can work towards and what we can work on. So what we're doing now, because this is essentially turned into a big project. We have like the Insights Grant. We're continuing to do the FYE program with predominantly through the Sobey School of Business. We would love to be able to implement it in other programs and work with the first year faculty to be able to do so. We have our SSHRC Insights Grant that we're working on. We've created a student success mobile app, which is going to be implemented here at St. Mary's at St. FX for sure. I am leading a project development grant right now. Well, I just applied for it. Thank you to my co-directors and collaborators, where we're going to be trying to understand what inclusion looks like for everyone. Because at this point, what inclusion looks like for me is going to be different for everybody else. And at this point, to be able to implement something, there's barriers that people have that we just have no idea about. And if we don't know them, how do we provide them with resources? We can't. And I don't think that a single scale is going to answer that question, right? There's a typology that needs to be involved here. And I think that that's something that we need to consider. And that's what that grant's for. We're developing partnership relationships through the IURN grants right now for 2024. We helped develop this new Spark program that has come out this year. And we're also doing research right now to see if it's effective in relation to the FYE program. And we're looking at identifying EDI, like in Banner, right? Trying to get the more EDIA based, like collecting information from students and being able to track their success through the Banner. Thanks. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi, Katelynn. I have a question online, and it's from me.
Oh,
so the question that I have in presenting the online versus in-person comparison, maybe just a reflection on some of the reasons why the online might have been, people felt like less like they belonged, or they didn't do as well. Because I do appreciate that you mentioned, there's issues of access to certain resources that aren't readily available online yet. too. Why I'm mentioning this point is that, you know, now that, well, I want to say now that there seems to be this feeling that COVID is behind us, which it's not at all. You know, there's a great push or pull to come back in person. And it can be very difficult to champion, well, things like this hybrid conference. That wasn't hard with the group we have putting this conference on, but it's been kind of tough. I'm a person who, for me, online is accessible. Online is where, you know, I shine a lot more. So my question or comment is that, you know, perhaps, well, there's a selection issue there in terms of, you know, opening up more recruitment of students who prefer and for whom actually the online learning is the accessible learning. And in fact, they wouldn't be students if it weren't for the online modality. So just, I guess I just wanted to say those things and just ask for your reflection on that.
Vurain said he can take this.
Or Vurain, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's Lucy.
Yes.
So that's a really good question. That's an excellent question. That is something we deliberated and thought about and was the focus of a lot of the research. So what we found in the work we've done is that when you're thinking of the in-person versus online learning experience, so accessibility and all that is obviously very important. And obviously online learning is something that is going to be a central focus going on, for the future. That's really important. But what we found is that the in-person learning environment is fundamentally different from the online learning environment, right? So, and we need to prepare students to be able to work effectively in each of those environments, right? So, and there's a lot of research on this, and some of our findings have indicated that, you know, when you're learning, one example of the differences is when you're learning in person versus online, there's very different time norms and very different time structures, right? And that makes a huge impact on student learning, right? So you can think of the experience of learning in person, right? There's a clear schedule. There's norms around eating and walking between classes and being next to other students and expectations that at this time you're going to do this and you have to prepare for this and this. And you know, things are very structured, typically in online, in-person learning. And that's very different from online learning, where there isn't as much structure and the norms aren't as defined, and that has a tremendous impact on learning. So the key takeaway, at least from our research, is that yes, learning online is important, but we need to take time to help our students learn how to learn effectively online, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that does. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and before we go, I think we're getting told that our time's up, but
yeah,
we'd like to, we've forgotten to mention and thank. Right.
I have a comment and a question, and I know there's another question here as well. My comment is really to you, Katelynn, and I really appreciate you sharing your opening bit. And I think that it's important that you know it's not just that team that's proud of you and views you as a valuable colleague. You teach for us, and we all do. My question then is about the time management. Do you think that the program that you're implementing for time management specifically needs to be different for those students who are online versus those who are in person?
Yeah, it does. One thing that is the one big thing that is different in regards to the online and the in-person is that the online people have the autonomy to be able to do it when it's fit for them, where the in-person are doing it in the classes that we have it scheduled for them. So there is a consistency where the students are reporting like how their time management changes as it goes on, but we do need that. We need to be able to see. Basically, from the beginning, what we looked at is trying to get an understanding is how the students were using their time online versus in person. And we've seen a lot where the people that were in person spent a lot of time traveling. They spent a lot of time eating. Where the people who were were online, you could see there was more, like they're doing a lot more errands, house space, like, you know, things, self-care. Leisure time, right? A lot of self-care and Netflix. We did see a lot of those things. So again, we thought we were thinking that one of the big things we needed to focus on was maybe in regards to time management and from the like in person is like how do they create their own, like not necessarily, like, because obviously it's a barrier to have Netflix sitting in the next room or like your TV or your bed. Basically, you know, setting up structures that they're in their learning space and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that needs to essentially be done for the online environment.